Today, more than 40 detention centre workers signed an open letter to the Prime Minister, daring him to prosecute them and stating that they'd continue to advocate for their patients. Well, joining us now in the studio is one of the doctors who signed that letter. Dr Peter Young was the Director of Mental Health at the private company contracted by the federal government to provide care in Australia's mainland and offshore immigration detention centres. He spent almost 3 years with the company, International Health and Medical Services, and left last year. Dr Young, welcome to The Drum.
Thank you.
Now, this letter that you and your colleagues have signed does make a direct challenge to the Prime Minister to prosecute you, to jail you. How hard was it for you to make that decision to sign it?
It's certainly a serious decision to do that, but we felt that this legislation created such a restriction on medical practice and what are the normal ethical obligations of doctors and healthcare workers that it was necessary.
What are the sorts of conditions that you're seeing there that you feel you will not be able to speak out about under this new law?
Well, the law seems to be very restrictive and to prevent all sorts of discussion, not just speaking out about the conditions in the centres and not just speaking out in public but speaking in private through the normal sorts of professional channels that doctors have, speaking with each other. But even to the extent of not being able to engage in other types of medical activities like discussing cases with colleagues, discussing collecting data and reporting on that amongst colleagues, having even professional supervision. All of these things are outlawed by the new Act.
So what do you fear could be the effect of this Act on the asylum seekers in these centres?
So I think it's clear that anything that makes a place like this less transparent and less open to any sort of scrutiny is going to make it a more dangerous place.
The Border Force Commissioner says that this law is not intended to restrict you, particularly in notifying if an individual has a risk to their health or indeed their life. And he also says that there are whistleblower protections in place that would allow you to speak out if you felt you needed to. Does that provide some comfort for you?
Well, not really, because those are quite narrow provisions. It has a much broader range of restrictions than that. So, for instance, things like speaking about the mental health screening data, which is one thing I was involved in developing the systems to do, that is something which is completely not allowed under this legislation. So talking about any de-identified case data, even amongst professionals, is also completely disallowed. So it goes well beyond sort of speaking out on specific issues about people's individual health.
So just briefly, do you think you're putting yourself in danger even by speaking to us tonight?
I think that these things I've already spoken about, I think, in other types of forums, so I would hope that doesn't create a particular risk.
Well, let's bring in the panel now. Anthony Bencher, this is an extraordinary letter. You've been an advisor to a former Prime Minister, John Howard. If you were advising the current Prime Minister, what would you say that his response should be to this challenge?
I think the proof of the pudding is probably in the eating. A lot of these provisions have existed since the 70s, Eleanor, in the Crimes Act. Provisions covering suppliers and subcontractors existed at state and federal levels about activities of a subcontractor is the responsibility of the contractor. The Minister himself, in response to this letter, has put out a statement saying that general claims about conditions in immigration detention centres will not be restricted by this legislation. And of course, as noted before, by Mr Barnes, this has received broadly cross-party support. So I think that should give some comfort to people as a kind of the new Act comes into force.
It's received the support of the Labor Party. I don't think it's received the support of the Greens. But why was it necessary then to even put a new Act in place to impose these restrictions?
This is part of the reform that the federal government is undertaking to integrate immigration and customs and to improve border protections in Australia.
Ian Hickey, you haven't worked in detention centres as a doctor, but if you had, would you sign the letter?
Yes. There's a very important other issue here. I agree with Anthony, no one's going to get prosecuted. But that's not really the intention. We've seen this in a number of other jurisdictions. I've been involved in mental health reviews of psychiatric hospitals. and gone to people and said, would you participate in the review? They said, no, I've been told by my employer that I'm restricted. I go, you're not restricted on professional issues. You're not restricted on talking about what you have an obligation to talk about, because these are settings in which people's rights are held back and we require transparency. There's no doubt professions have a role. So I'm really glad the professions are saying right up front, we're not going to be intimidated by this. We will speak on the issues that it's normal to speak about. There are confidentiality issues, there are normal provisions in employment about specific cases, and there are privacy issues to be respected. But I don't think the intention is actually to prosecute anybody. The intention, as we've seen in some other areas of public policy and public administration, is to prevent a kind of openness. And I think it's very important for the professions to say, look, we've got obligations as employees, sure, but we also have obligations to the wider society in these professions, particularly in these areas in which there are vulnerable people at risk. So I think it's a great thing to come right out and say, no matter what the employment provisions are, there's a broader social responsibility.
Susan Carlin, what's your interpretation of this legislation? Is it as restrictive as the doctors are saying, or is it really not such a big problem?
I hope that it's not really such a big problem, but in matters relating to health, I'm always much more inclined to listen to what health practitioners have to say. And when so many health practitioner bodies like the AMA, the nurses' organisations, so many of them are opposing this act, that raises real flags for me, that even if they raise issues with the government body, if they about abuse of children, for example, if the government body says you're not allowed to take this any further, then there is nothing they can do. And so when we are seeing what we are with the Royal Commission into abuse of children happening at the moment, where abuse of children was so suppressed and hushed up, and the ongoing damage that caused, I think it is really wise for us to be listening very carefully to what the health practitioners on the ground are saying. And if they're saying they have major concerns about this, that's something that needs to be taken really seriously.
Well, Dr Young, what do you say to Anthony Bench's suggestion that really this is not as restrictive as you're suggesting it is?
Well, I think it is much more restrictive than health practitioners have generally understood their roles to be, and it impinges on their responsibilities, their ethical responsibilities, to a much greater extent than was supposed. It's not really comforting when we know that when workers in the Nauru reported these incidents of child abuse, they were sacked and deported. I know from my own experience, not being allowed to report on mental health data, which collected in detention, which was exactly the same mental health data that is collected right across Australia by every single mental health service and is publicly reported. The same data is treated like a state secret when it's in immigration detention. It's just not an open, transparent system, and that's what it needs to be.
And Anthony Bench, what about that suggestion from Ian Hickey that it's not really intended to actually prosecute people, but it is intended to impose another veil of secrecy over this whole immigration detention system?
I think that since the Abbott government was elected and stronger borders were returned to Australia, there's been a plethora of information released in all different ways. I think in this area, as well as many others, irrespective of what governments hope for and even what they legislate, information does get out. And so I think that one way or another, governments will continue to be held to account for the number of people that come to Australia in leaky boats, the number of people who may die at sea, and also the conditions in these centres.